"I've got half the department in my backyard and someone just called 911 on us," Jake muttered, staring at the blue and red lights flashing through the trees. It would have been funny if it weren't so absurd. A dozen cops, some still wearing badge clips, some in tactical polos, others with department tattoos visible, were now standing in stunned silence, mid-burger bite, as two patrol cars rolled up to the house with sirens blaring. The kicker? Jake was a police captain, the literal boss of the precinct that had just responded to his own housewarming party. And across the street, wine glass in hand and smug smile in full bloom, stood the queen of neighborhood entitlement, Karen Wilkins, head of the HOA and self-declared savior of suburban order. She had no idea who she just picked a fight with, and neither did the dispatchers. Jake Morales had been looking forward to this day for months. After years on the force, he and Lena had finally bought their dream home in the sleepy suburb of Ashford Hills. It was the kind of place where lawnmowers hummed on Saturdays, kids rode scooters to the ice cream truck, and people waved as they drove past. Well, most people. Karen Wilkins was the exception. From the moment the moving truck rolled in, she had been watching their house like a hawk. First, it was about the non-standard mailbox. Then, the improperly angled welcome mat. Then she slipped a printed flyer into their door warning about unsanctioned use of string lights on hedges. Jake thought it was some kind of initiation ritual. He quickly learned she was serious and relentless. But today was supposed to be different. They had kept the guest list small, just family, close friends, and a handful of Jake's fellow officers from the department. Lena decorated the backyard with paper lanterns, set up a buffet table, and even organized a neighborhood-friendly playlist. Nothing too loud. No beer kegs or blaring bass. Just good food, good company, and a night to finally feel at home. By 6:30, the backyard was buzzing with laughter. Officers from all units mingled easily, swapping stories about arrests, squad car mishaps, and the infamous turkey chase incident of last Thanksgiving. Even Jake's boss, Deputy Chief Rayburn, had dropped by for a burger. Lena's lemon bars were a hit. A few kids played catch near the fence while the adults sipped soda and told the kind of stories only cops would find funny. That was when Karen spotted Officer Tina Grant, still wearing her sidearm and badge lanyard. From her porch perch, she dialed 911 with the flair of a woman reporting a major crime. According to the later police log, she reported a gang of impersonators, flashing badges and possibly plotting something. She described the scene as intimidating and unauthorized. She even said there was an illegal assembly of more than 20 people. Inside the patrol car, the dispatcher called it in like any other suspicious gathering. Officers Romero and Sullivan were new to the department and unfamiliar with Jake's address. All they knew was that someone reported armed impersonators and flashing badges. They followed protocol, sirens on, backup requested. Within minutes, the sound of police sirens echoed through the neighborhood, turning heads and sending kids scattering indoors. The moment the squad car tires screeched to a halt outside his house, Jake knew something was off. He set down his drink and walked to the gate. The officers stepped out, hands on holsters, faces tense. It was like watching a training scenario in real time, only this wasn't a drill. Romero's voice was loud and clear. "Hands where we can see them. Everybody stay where you are." For a few terrifying seconds, half the crowd froze, unsure whether to comply or laugh. Jake stepped forward slowly, holding up his badge. "Captain Jake Morales, ID 7460. This is my home. These are my officers." Romero blinked, then squinted at Jake's face. Sullivan looked past him and saw Chief Rayburn holding a lemonade, jaw already halfway to the floor. "You have got to be kidding me," Rayburn muttered. As the realization set in, the mood shifted from confusion to awkward disbelief. Some officers chuckled nervously. Manny raised a red Solo cup like a toast. "Well, this is a first," he said. "Rated by our own rookies." But it wasn't funny to Jake. Not yet. He looked across the street where Karen still stood watching. When he locked eyes with her, she raised her wine glass and gave a smug little nod. The kind of nod that said "You're welcome, neighborhood." That's when it hit him. She thought she was doing a civic duty. She believed she just saved the street from some imagined threat. And worst of all, she didn't recognize a single badge, a single uniform, a single face of the people sworn to protect her. That level of ignorance wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Officer Romero apologized quickly and quietly, explaining the mix-up. Jake was gracious on the surface but burning inside. Not because of the mistake. They had done what they were trained to do. It was the trigger that enraged him. Karen had escalated a peaceful event into a near-tactical response. She had put lives in danger with a phone call. If one officer hadn't recognized him in time, someone could have drawn a weapon. A child could have been caught in the chaos. Lena came up behind him, her voice low. "That woman really just called 911 on your own team, didn't she?" Jake nodded slowly. "And she thinks she can get away with it." Across the yard, Tina whispered something to Manny, who started recording Karen from a distance. She was still talking on her phone, loudly now, saying something about pressing charges on fake officers. Jake took a deep breath and turned back toward the party. The music had stopped. People looked tense. "Relax everyone," Jake called out. "Everything's fine. Just a little misunderstanding. Let's fire the grill back up." Rayburn walked over and clapped him on the back. "You want me to handle it?" Jake shook his head. "No. I'll take care of her." Rayburn raised an eyebrow. "You're gonna do it the Morales way, huh?" Jake didn't answer. He just stared across the street. Because he knew something Karen didn't. This wasn't just some HOA drama anymore. This was a false police report. A public slander. And by the time he was done, Karen would wish all she'd done was complain about his mailbox. He walked back to Lena, leaned in, and whispered, "I hope she enjoys her quiet neighborhood. It's about to get real noisy." Jake didn't sleep much that night. He kept replaying the entire scene in his mind, the look on Karen's face when the sirens pulled up, the way she pointed toward his backyard like she was reporting an escaped zoo animal, and the sheer chaos of his fellow officers raising their hands at a party meant to celebrate peace and new beginnings. Lena sat beside him on the couch, her hand resting lightly on his leg as she scrolled through the neighborhood Facebook group. Karen had already posted a rant titled "Suspicious Gathering at 84 Stonebridge Drive," complete with a blurry photo taken from behind her curtains. The comments were a mixed bag. A few neighbors praised her vigilance, others joked about cosplaying cops, and one brave soul named Alex simply wrote, "Karen, you need help." Jake didn't reply. He knew better than to feed the flames. But inside something was boiling. It wasn't just about his party being ruined. It wasn't just the embarrassment of having sirens blare in front of his house. It was the fact that someone in his own community had called the police on him without the slightest attempt to talk or even ask questions. Karen hadn't knocked on his door. She hadn't sent a message. She jumped straight to emergency services, because that's what entitled people like her did. They weaponized panic. And for once, she picked the wrong target. The next morning, Jake sat at his dining room table with a cup of black coffee and his laptop open. His inbox had blown up overnight. Messages from officers, his chief, even the mayor's office trickled in, all asking variations of the same question: what exactly happened? He typed up a full incident report, attaching photos, video footage from Tina's phone, and screenshots from the HOA Facebook group. He included timestamps, witness names, and the 911 transcript one of his dispatch friends had quietly emailed over. It was a textbook false report. She had said, in no uncertain terms, that there were armed impersonators flashing fake badges and possibly dealing drugs. The irony of her calling a group of real officers fake was enough to make his eye twitch. By mid-morning, Jake made a call to Internal Affairs. Not to file a complaint against the responding officers. They had followed procedure and de-escalated professionally, but to get their support in building a case against Karen. IA flagged the call as a civilian misconduct complaint. That triggered a chain reaction. Next, he contacted the city attorney's office to explore whether Karen's call qualified as a public nuisance, abuse of 911 services, and slander of public officials. The answer? Potentially yes on all three counts. Lena entered the room, still in her robe, holding her phone out like it was on fire. She's at it again. Now she's saying you threatened her during the standoff. She wrote, and I quote, "He glared at me with clear intent to intimidate. I feared for my life." Jake let out a long, controlled breath. She's laying it on thick. Good. She's making it easier. Around noon, he met with Manny and Tina at a local coffee shop just outside the neighborhood. They brought more footage, including a few candid shots of Karen standing on her porch grinning like she just won a prize. Manny leaned in and said, "You know she's done this before, right? Remember the incident last year with that teenage delivery driver? She claimed he was casing houses. Turns out he was looking for a dropped phone." Jake nodded. "I pulled her name up. She's filed 27 complaints in the last 12 months. Half of them to 911. The rest through the HOA's violation reporting tool. She called the cops on a garage sale once." Tina raised an eyebrow. "A garage sale?" Manny grinned. "Said it was an illegal marketplace. Violated HOA bylaws about commercial activity. The guy was selling used baby clothes." Jake leaned back and rubbed his chin. "This is a pattern. A weaponized pattern of behavior." Tina opened her folder and pulled out a printout of HOA board members. Karen had recently become vice president after the previous VP resigned unexpectedly. Rumor had it she forced him out after accusing him of collusion with property owners to lower standards. It sounded ridiculous, but to people like Karen, HOA politics were a battlefield. Back at home, Jake compiled everything into a neat package. His own official statement, the patrol report, video footage, witness lists, screenshots, and even an affidavit from Rayburn verifying his identity as a commanding officer. He sent the packet to the city attorney, marked urgent. Then, he called a contact of his, Alex Benson, a civil rights lawyer who also happened to live 3 blocks away and had his own history with Karen. A few months back, she had tried to fine him for painting his porch an unapproved shade of beige. He won in mediation. She hasn't spoken to him since. When Jake explained what had happened, Alex whistled. "You've got a clear case for harassment and defamation. If I were you, I'd prepare for a civil suit. And if we're lucky, she'll bury herself even deeper before we file." That night, Karen made her next move. A typed letter slipped into Jake's mailbox, printed on HOA letterhead and filled with bold accusations. The tone was hilariously formal, citing imaginary clauses like Article 6B, limitations on paramilitary gatherings, and Section 4D, Neighborhood Safety Response Protocols. Jake laughed so hard he nearly dropped the paper. It ended with a threat to bring the issue to the county commissioner if lawless behavior continued. Lena read it aloud in a mock British accent while Jake filmed her for his friends. The joke helped, but deep down, Jake was already setting the stage. The next day, Jake attended the monthly HOA meeting, which Karen had announced would be mandatory for all residents. The room was packed, the air stiff with tension. Karen stood at the front of the community clubhouse in a red blazer, hair sculpted like she was preparing for a live debate. Jake walked in and took a seat near the front. Karen's eyes flicked toward him, then immediately back to her note. "Before we begin," she said, her voice tight, "I'd like to address the recent incident on Stonebridge Drive. Several neighbors expressed concern over the large, unauthorized gathering that took place. I took action to ensure our safety." Jake raised his hand. "Did those neighbors include anyone besides you?" Karen paused. "I don't have to disclose." Jake cut in, calm and even. "Because I have signed statements from 6 neighbors who say you never contacted them. I also have the 911 transcript where you accused off-duty law enforcement of impersonating police officers. The room stirred. A few board members exchanged glances. Karen flushed. This isn't a courtroom, Mr. Morales. No, Jake said, but the next place we meet might be. The crowd went silent. Karen fumbled her papers. If you're threatening legal action. Jake stood. Not a threat. A courtesy. He turned and walked out, leaving the room buzzing. He didn't need to stay. His point was made. Karen was in too deep now, and he was just getting started. The neighborhood wasn't hers anymore. And by the time he was done, everyone in Ashford Hills would know it. The silence that followed Jake's words at the HOA meeting carried more weight than any gavel ever could. Karen's carefully rehearsed monologue had crumbled like wet paper, and the air in the clubhouse buzzed with a mix of shock, curiosity, and something she hadn't faced in years, resistance. As Jake walked out with calm, deliberate steps, he could already hear murmurs behind him. Some were neighbors whispering to each other. Others were board members realizing they might have backed the wrong queen bee. And Karen, who always considered herself untouchable in her little fiefdom, had finally been publicly challenged by someone with more than petty fines and empty threats in his arsenal. Jake didn't stop walking until he got back home. Lena was waiting for him with a smirk and a fresh printout in her hand. She posted again, she said, handing him the paper. The newest post from Karen read, "Disruptive residents are attempting to intimidate board leadership. Legal authorities have been notified." Jake scanned it and couldn't help but chuckle. "She really thinks she's the victim," he said, setting the paper on the counter. "She's digging her own hole." That night, Jake and Lena sat on their back porch going over their next step. The neighborhood was quiet, but the tension lingered in the air like leftover smoke. They were joined by Alex, the civil rights attorney and fellow resident, who brought his laptop and a bottle of wine. They opened a shared folder where they had begun gathering testimonies from neighbors, people who had been too afraid to speak against Karen before but now felt empowered to share their stories. One couple said Karen had tried to report their adopted daughter for loitering in front of her own home. Another neighbor had been fined 3 times for a basketball hoop that Karen claimed violated visual uniformity, even though several other homes had similar ones. Someone else mentioned her going through their recycling bin to check for unapproved materials. What emerged was a clear pattern. Karen had been using her authority to harass and intimidate, bending HOA rules into weapons she wielded against those who didn't bend to her will. Alex explained how they could move forward. If they documented enough evidence of harassment, discrimination, and false reporting, they could file a formal complaint with the city's Department of Neighborhood Oversight. That alone could force the HOA board into emergency elections. If they pursued civil action, they could seek damages and force Karen to resign through a court mandate. "It won't be quick," Alex warned, "but the more public this becomes, the less she'll be able to hide behind her clipboard and HOA letterhead." The next day, Jake filed a public records request for all emergency calls placed from Karen Wilkins' address in the past year. When the report came back, it was staggering. Over 30 calls, everything from suspicious noise to potential domestic threats, most of which were dismissed or unfounded. A few calls had even resulted in dangerous miscommunications, like the time she reported a landscaper's hedge trimmer as a weapon. One report detailed an officer being bitten by her unleashed dog when he tried to follow up. Jake compiled all the data, added neighbor testimonies, video clips, and screenshots of Karen's online rants, then sent the updated file to the city attorney's office with a formal letter signed by 7 homeowners. The title of the file was simple and direct: Wilkins vs. Ashford Hills, HOA Abuse Pattern. Meanwhile, Karen began to sense she was losing her grip. She doubled down on her tactics. She mailed out a new round of violation notices, half of which were for nonsense infractions like holiday lights still visible after sunset and wind chimes audible beyond 15 feet. But this time people pushed back. Several homeowners started responding with their own letters, some with legal representation, others with open defiance. A neighbor named Darnell posted a photo of his wind chimes with a sign beneath them that read, "Now with extra volume, just for you, Karen." Karen called an emergency HOA meeting to regain control. She opened with another speech filled with buzzwords like community safety, deteriorating standards, and hostile influences. But this time, she was met with blank stares and, in some cases, eye rolls. One board member asked why she had reported their treasurer for unapproved lawn behavior. Another asked if she had really demanded police intervention at a child's lemonade stand last summer. Karen turned red and snapped that it was unsanitary, which only made things worse. Jake didn't attend the meeting in person, but Lena did. She live-texted him updates as Karen lost her composure. Apparently, she tried to shout over members who questioned her decisions and eventually stormed out when one neighbor suggested that perhaps she should take a leave of absence. As Lena put it, Karen just walked out like a bad sitcom character who realized she isn't the main star anymore. Over the weekend, Jake received a call from the city attorney's office. They had reviewed the materials and determined there was enough evidence to proceed with a formal investigation. An inspector would be visiting the neighborhood within a week to conduct interviews and gather statements. Jake hung up the phone and felt a weight begin to lift. This wasn't about petty revenge anymore, it was about accountability. By Monday, rumors were flying. Word spread quickly that an official investigator was coming. Some neighbors who had once been quiet started speaking up in the group chat, sharing passive-aggressive memes and poking fun at Karen's infamous drone patrols. Someone even made a parody HOA newsletter titled, The Ashford Harassment Herald, filled with fake violation notices like breathing too loud on a Tuesday and unauthorized smiling. Jake printed out a copy and taped it to the inside of his garage door. Karen, meanwhile, tried to regain her footing by placing a massive sign on her lawn that read, "I will not be silenced." It was so over the top that a photo of it ended up on a local community subreddit, and within hours it became a meme. Comments flooded in, some calling her a discount dictator, others comparing her to sitcom villains. One comment said, "When the HOA becomes the HOA Illuminati." That night, Jake got a knock on his door. It was a quiet, older man with a clipboard, khakis, and a badge from the city inspector's office. He introduced himself and said he was here to begin interviews. Jake welcomed him inside and handed over a neatly organized binder. As the inspector flipped through the first few pages, he raised an eyebrow and said, "You weren't kidding. This is one of the most well-documented neighborhood complaints I've ever seen." Jake smiled slightly. "I figured if I was going to do this, I might as well do it the right way." The inspector looked up. "This isn't just a neighborhood dispute. This is systemic abuse of authority." Jake nodded. "Exactly. And now it's time everyone sees that in broad daylight." Jake could feel the entire neighborhood shifting. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but more like a pressure release valve hissing after years of being clamped down under Karen's rule. People were walking their dogs past her house a little slower, a little bolder. Kids who once avoided her sidewalk now zipped by on scooters like she didn't exist. Even the neighborhood Facebook group had gone suspiciously quiet, save for a few vague posts from Karen that were more cryptic than commanding. She wrote things like, "Some people just don't appreciate structure," and "Order always prevails over chaos," but the likes and comments were practically non-existent. Her control was unraveling, and she knew it. Meanwhile, Jake's house was buzzing with quiet strategy. He, Lena, and Alex met with the city investigator twice over the course of a week. The inspector interviewed several neighbors and HOA board members, and his expression grew darker with every testimony. One neighbor told him how Karen fined them for using a wreath that wasn't seasonal enough. Another described how Karen had shouted at her through the fence for playing jazz music with threatening undertones. The inspector didn't laugh. He wrote everything down with professional precision and eventually requested full access to the HOA's financials. That was when things got serious. Karen tried to block the inspection. She claimed the HOA had internal privacy policies, and that any board member sharing documents would face immediate removal. But not everyone was afraid anymore. Gerald, the treasurer who had been silent for months, turned over a flash drive with 5 years of budget record. It included suspicious payments marked as community safety enhancements and aesthetic enforcement bonuses, all of which traced back to accounts tied to Karen or her cousin's landscaping company. Jake sat in his living room with Lena and Alex when the investigator called to confirm what they already suspected. Karen had been misusing HOA funds to upgrade her own property: new patio tiles, upgraded fencing, custom outdoor lighting, and labeling it as shared community improvements. She'd even been writing reimbursement checks to herself under fake project code. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. It was fraud. Within 2 days, the city attorney's office filed a request for a temporary injunction to freeze HOA discretionary funds while the investigation proceeded. A court date was set. Karen was served the official documents at 7:15 in the morning by a uniformed city officer who she tried to accuse of trespassing. He calmly explained he was acting under court authority, and that if she refused the paperwork, she'd be in violation of a court order. She took the papers with trembling fingers, slammed the door, and didn't emerge for the rest of the day. By that weekend, word spread that a full HOA audit was now publicly underway. A special community meeting was called by several board members to discuss Karen's suspension and possible removal. Jake didn't even need to speak at the meeting; everyone else did it for him. Neighbors lined up to share stories, one after the other, in a stream that painted a clear picture of an HOA dictatorship turned toxic. A woman in her 70s tearfully recalled being fined for her granddaughter drawing chalk art on the sidewalk. A veteran neighbor talked about having a flagpole forcibly removed from his lawn for being visually aggressive. The atmosphere wasn't just tense, it was cathartic. Karen arrived 30 minutes late, dressed in a sharp pantsuit and carrying a thick binder of prepared remarks. She walked to the front of the clubhouse with stiff shoulders, but no one clapped. No one nodded. Her presence didn't command fear anymore, only resentment and mild embarrassment. She tried to read from her binder, but a board member interrupted her mid-sentence to ask where the approval for her backyard security system came from. She stammered something about emergency provisions, before another neighbor raised a hand and asked why the HOA paid for her new retaining wall. Her voice cracked. "I have worked tirelessly to uphold standards here," she said. "And this is how you repay me?" Jake stood up. Not to yell or grandstand, but simply to speak with finality. "Karen," he said, "you didn't uphold standards. You enforced control. You didn't build a community. You built a fiefdom. And now it's over." That line hung in the air like a courtroom verdict. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around, scanning for allies. No one met her eyes. Not even the woman who used to co-sign every complaint she sent out. She gathered her papers, her expression slipping from defiant to exposed, and walked out without another word. The next morning, Karen's house had a for sale sign out front. Not a small, discreet one either, a massive post with bold letters reading, "Motivated Seller." Word was, she'd taken a leave from the HOA pending the results of the investigation, but everyone knew she wouldn't be back. Her power was gone. The audit was ongoing, the charges pending, and the neighborhood she once ruled with mailed citations and passive-aggressive notes now viewed her as a cautionary tale. Jake received a call from the city investigator again. He thanked him for his thorough documentation, his cooperation, and for handling the matter with professionalism. "In my 10 years," the inspector said, "I've never seen a neighborhood turn against a tyrant so quickly and cleanly. You gave them the push they needed." Jake thanked him, but deep down, he knew it wasn't just him. It was every neighbor who finally chose to speak up. It was Lena's calm encouragement. It was Alex's legal insight. It was even the rookies who accidentally responded to that party and triggered this entire chain of events. A few days later, the new HOA interim president, an elderly woman named Marlene who wore cat-themed sweaters and baked muffins for meetings, invited Jake to the next board session. She offered him a seat on the new ethics committee. He respectfully declined but offered to train the committee on fair conflict resolution. He'd had enough HOA for a lifetime, but he wasn't going to leave his neighbors unprotected ever again. That evening, the sun dipped low over Ashford Hills as kids played soccer in the street and families grilled in their yards. The clubhouse lights were on, laughter echoing from the open windows. Jake and Lena sat on their porch sipping tea, watching the neighborhood they had fought so hard for come back to life. For the first time since moving in, it felt like home, not because they won a battle, but because they helped tear down a wall of fear and replace it with something better. A real community. No more HOA dictatorship, no more threats in mailboxes, and no more Karen at the helm. Just neighbors, finally breathing free. The peace that followed Karen's downfall was more than just silence. It was an entirely new atmosphere. Where the community had once been rigid and rule-obsessed, people now smiled more often, lingered in driveways to talk, and waved at Jake and Lena with genuine warmth instead of polite obligation. The changes weren't just social either. The new interim HOA board, led by Marlene and a few longtime residents who had quietly endured Karen's reign, began rewriting the community guidelines to reflect common sense, fairness, and, above all, basic human decency. The difference was night and day. Jake couldn't walk his dog without someone stopping to thank him for what he did, and Lena kept getting homemade cookies delivered with notes that said things like, "Thanks for standing up," or "We can breathe again." Still, Jake wasn't one to dwell in victory. As satisfying as it was to see Karen gone and the neighborhood healing, he kept his focus forward. He resumed full duties at the department and quietly declined every invitation to run for an official HOA seat, though he was eventually coaxed into giving a brief community talk on leadership and de-escalation. He kept it short, light-hearted, and left the crowd laughing when he joked about becoming the first man to be both party host and suspect in a police raid involving his own precinct. The best part? Even the on-duty officers from that day showed up and gave him a standing ovation. But one afternoon, several weeks after the storm had passed, Jake received a certified letter addressed not from Karen, but from a law firm representing her. Lena read it over his shoulder with one eyebrow raised, her expression hovering between amusement and disbelief. The letter was a formal notice informing Jake of Karen's intent to pursue damages due to emotional distress, defamation, and community sabotage. Jake leaned back in his chair, let out a dry laugh, and said, "Of course she's not done." Lena shook her head and said, "She can't help herself. Some people just can't lose quietly." Jake immediately called Alex, who laughed even harder than he did. "Let her file," Alex said. "We've got a mountain of documentation, sworn testimony, a fraud investigation, and video proof. If she wants to go to court, she's walking into a buzzsaw." Jake agreed to let Alex handle the response. They prepared a counterclaim for frivolous litigation and filed a protective order just in case she tried to retaliate again through legal nuisance. The suit never actually made it to court. Within 3 weeks, Karen's lawyer quietly withdrew the filing, likely after reviewing the file Alex had prepared. It was a thick, airtight compilation of every incident, lie, and abusive act Karen had committed under the banner of HOA enforcement. When the withdrawal was confirmed, Alex called Jake with a grin in his voice. She thought she had claws, but it turns out she was just waving salad tongs. Jake didn't even feel triumphant at that point, just relieved. The drama was finally, truly over. Karen's house officially sold a month later to a young couple with a newborn and 2 rescue dogs. They moved in without ceremony, no ridiculous decorations or plastic flamingos, just a quiet wave across the fence and a plate of cookies dropped off for Jake and Lena. It felt like a full-circle moment. The villain was gone, and new life had taken her place. One sunny Saturday morning, Marlene called Jake and asked if he and Lena could stop by the clubhouse for a quick thank you. Jake hesitated, sensing something brewing, but Lena nudged him to go. When they arrived, the entire community was waiting. Balloons were strung across the fence, a massive grill was fired up, and banners hung from the windows that read things like "Ashford thanks you" and "Captain of the Block." Kids ran around with water balloons, and someone had even printed t-shirts with a cartoon badge and the words, "Housewarming Hero" on the back. In the center of it all stood Marlene holding a microphone and a wooden plaque. She gestured for Jake to come forward. "This man," she said, "not only stood up for his home and his family, but he reminded all of us that neighborhoods are built on trust, not fear. On community, not control. And though he never asked for recognition, we thought it was about time we gave him some anyway." The crowd clapped, cheered, and chanted his name. Jake, usually so comfortable commanding a room full of officers, felt a little sheepish. He accepted the plaque, which read, "For outstanding service to the community of Ashford Hills, leadership, integrity, and the right kind of justice." Marlene then handed the mic to Lena, who wasn't even on the schedule, but the crowd insisted she speak. She cleared her throat, smiled, and said, "I just want to say, this was never about a party. It was about standing up when someone thought they could bully the rest of us into silence. And I'm so proud of everyone here for showing that real neighbors have each other's backs." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and paper lanterns began to glow in the backyard, the same ones they'd used for the party that started everything, Jake and Lena sat on their porch, sipping lemonade and watching the street come alive. Kids biked in circles. Neighbors chatted by mailboxes. Music floated gently from the open windows of a nearby home. And Jake could finally see what this neighborhood was meant to be. Not a collection of houses trapped under one person's rule, but a place where people felt safe, connected, and welcomed. He turned to Lena and said, "You know, this was the craziest introduction to a neighborhood I've ever had." She laughed. "At least you made an impression." Jake smiled and nodded. "Let's hope we never have to do it again." A few weeks later, a delivery arrived at Jake's home with no sender listed. Inside was a shadow box containing a tiny model police badge, a miniature plastic lawn flamingo, and a sticker that said, "Ashford's Real Sheriff." There was no note, but Jake had a good guess who sent it. Probably Manny or one of the other officers from that wild night. He hung it in the garage next to the HOA violation notice Karen once mailed about his porch light being too bright for community harmony. Now it was just a souvenir from a story too strange to make up. As the months passed, Ashford Hills continued to thrive. New events sprang up. Game nights, yard sales, movie nights on the lawn, all organized by the people instead of enforced by the board. Rules still existed, but they were reasonable now, discussed in the open, and voted on with real input. And somewhere in a far quieter suburb, Karen Wilkins was likely staring out her new window, waiting for someone to park 3 inches over the line. Jake didn't care. His home was peaceful, his neighbors were happy, and the shadows of old power had been swept away. It started with a housewarming and ended with a revolution. And for the first time in a long while, it truly felt like home.